Okay, good morning. We are on page 120 in Hemshech, Tzaddik Dalet, 121, I should correct myself, which is the parallel to Ayin Beis, page 1157. So we're coming to the conclusion of the first level of Bitl and Hedet Tfisis Makom, which we'll talk about soon some more. And after explaining the example, the difference between Seichel and Ratzon, and I'll just sum it up briefly because I elaborated yesterday on this, which is explaining essentially that though both are faculties and not the Etzem HaNefesh itself, because the Etzem HaNefesh, which means the core soul, which is the divine energy basically, is beyond any faculties. It's not the sum of the parts. It's not made up of, it's not a composite of faculties, not of Keiches Pnimim and not Keiches Makifim, not of the inner, what did I call, Pnimi is the inner immanent faculties, and not the Makif transcendent faculties like Ratzon. And yet, and therefore, but everything originates from the soul. But like we explained, you can't call the soul a mocker, a source. A source indicates that something already is in a form of being a source to something else. You could say a source on the sun is a source to sunlight. But the nefesh, you cannot say everything originates from the neshama, but like he said, you can't call it a mocker. You could say the neshama has the capacity for all these faculties. What he called it is the keiches atzmim. Sometimes it goes even higher. It says nefesh neisa keiches, that the soul has the capacity that carries the capacity of faculties. And here he's calling it keiches atzmim. The word he used, he said like this: that masharotzen rak masharotzen nimtze mekeiach harotzen hiyuli atzmi leisha keiach atzmi. So you can't call it a source. A source indicates some type of commensurate relationship. And yet, there's a fundamental difference between how Ratzon emerges from there and how Seichel emerges. Seichel emerges because it's a specific faculty with a particular function. So therefore it emerges, it is an existing be'efin shalei be'erech and nivdal, as he said. It's infinitely distant from the soul, and nivdal, separate from the koyach atzmi of seichel, like, for example, the sparks that come out of a flintstone. When it comes to Ratzon is infinitely distant from the soul as well as like seichel is. But its manner of expression, Ratzon is expressing the soul. It's a hispashtus hanefesh. It's not chutz me'etzem hanefesh, as he says, because at the end of the day, all it is an expression of whatever the soul wants to accomplish. So to say the neshama, the nefesh is Ratzon, you can't say that. You can't say the nefesh is seichel, but you can say the Ratzon is the nefesh, because it has nothing but reflecting and expressing the nefesh. Like somewhat like, not exactly, but when you say hu mekeme shalelam ve'ena ela mekeme, that hu mekeme shalelam, they could say God is in the place of the world, but you can't say the world is in the place of God. So you can't say Ratzon is the nefesh, even though, just for the record, the Rebbe brings, Chassidus brings, on the word Mesidus Nefesh, it says sometimes Mesidus Nefesh is Mesidus Ratzon. Why? And it brings a raya from the Psukim, because Nefesh and Ratzon sometimes go hand in hand. Why? Because the Ratzon is nothing but an expression of the Nefesh. Whereas Seichel is a particular functionality with a particular function. If the Seichel does not work in an intellectual, cognitive way with the whole process of Seichel, it's not Seichel. Ratzon does not have a shape like that. The Ratzon is what the Nefesh wants. Then the Ratzon will take on, activate the different faculties that the desire of the Nefesh is directing. Okay, so as such, now he's going to explain the same as the ideas with Oyer. Same as with Oyer. One more thing, let me sum up regarding the Kefen, I say. Okay, so like it was with Seichel, in order to explain and this is the most apparent Balbatisha reason why the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe bring the Yosher and Chezer, besides for deeper reasons that I explained when we learned the Ayin Beis, because it helps us understand the avodah of it. But the most obvious reason is because it gives us it allows us to visualize and depict and understand exactly how a koyach golei, a revealed faculty, draws out from the inner faculty, from the concealed, and even deeper, the atzmizdika faculties. And if you may remember, in the bottom of page 118, the Rebbe even added that in Keiches Atzmi itself, he said there were two levels. As they reveal the next level, the revealed faculties, the concealed and revealed faculties, and the way they are netuyim mishrashim, the way they are rooted in the etzem nefesh. Because when by understanding how it works, it allows us to have some type of semblance and understanding of this leap. That on one hand, it emerges from there. On the other hand, it's infinitely distant. The source is infinitely distant, so you can't call it a mucker in the nefesh or even the atzkeiches atzmim. So by giving the example of chezer, in seichel it was the questions you ask, the contradictions, the helomis, the concealments. In Ratzon, what was the chezer? Not a initial desire you have for something. Someone wants to go learn something, that's a regular yosher desire. That is basically revealing the concealed desire, it becomes revealed. Like we learned, if you remember, the classic Ratzon in the human being is ein adam b'lo Beis. A person is not complete without a home. So therefore, there's a Ratzon be'etzem hanefesh, Ratzon hamuchled ba'atzmusei, we learned. That the nefesh has a core element of it is to have a home. But that core element can remain concealed your entire life. Not only concealed, it's not even in a state of concealment. It's part of the nefesh's completion is to have ein adam b'lo Beis. It says also ein adam b'lo isha, but here we talked about Beis. Okay. Then there is where the Ratzon becomes activated. If you recall, we learned the levels of how Ratzon begins to awaken. There's what we call the heskim, that first you consider, it's a consideration, it's not a determination. Then there is a shakavataria, a deliberation, and then there's a determination, and now you're determined. But that determination still remains abstract because you're not necessarily pursuing building or buying a home. Ratzon, the word sinner, if you remember, I'm going back a while back here in Tzaddik Dalet, is when it begins the actual pursuit of the object of the desire. So what is the Ratzon Kodem, the Ratzon Klali like? It can be a desire that's just in a very abstract way. Yes, you did determine this is the right thing, but that's it. For years can pass, as we said, till it begins to actually stir in within you and say, okay, now the time has come. And now you begin being drawn to it, which means you start spelling out the details. And all the way to the Ratzon Kodem, as we learned, is the Ratzon that precedes the actual building, actual implementing it. And that is when you're already imagining and allocating resource, shir atzmei b'kayach. We learned all this earlier. So what do you see from this? What you see from this is that in the earliest stages, the Ratzon is in the nefesh, it's completely removed. You can't call it a tangible desire. It's a whole bunch of stages that it has to go through. So by learning about, and that would be a process of actually yosher. But remember, the shakavataria can be a process where you're weighing back and forth. So what he adds here with chezer is that when you ask questions and you challenge, and there's concealments, and you have to exert yourself to dig deeper, then you're accessing the deepest part. To go to the example of the home, you could want to have a home, and it could go very smoothly. You could actually, however much time it takes, but you could also challenge yourself and say, "Do I really need a home?" And is it really important? Maybe there are other priorities. The more you challenge yourself, the deeper the nefesh. You have to dig deeper to find that the core nefesh taka has a ratzon atzmi for a home. I'm giving this example on my own. He doesn't say this here. I'm just trying to connect it to that flow. Here, what he does say, the two examples is the kafir nesei, that and ostensibly initially he does not want to give a get, and the bezdin kafir nesei, how could they be kafir him? How could they compel him? When the Torah says it needs to be b'ritzeinei, it needs to be his desire, the answer is it is his desire. It's his core desire. So that's an atzmi. And the only way to get there is by compelling him, because on the outer level, the Yetzer Hara is controlling and not letting him access it. So that's the answer, because he really wants it. So the kfiyah means the effort. This is the so-called chayzer element of it. The second example he gave here was the ratzon of Kabbalah sale, where initially you don't have a passion or desire for it, but the Kabbalah sale compels you to actually desire it. And that comes from the das hanelam, as he said, and that's a Kabbalah sale. And afterwards, once the desire is awakened, he says it's much more intense and greater than the desire of ratzon of yosher. So what do we have from this? We have here the way it actually works, how the ratzon goli, the revealed desire, reflects the ratzon atzmi without being the ratzon atzmi, because the ratzon atzmi is something of the nefesh. The nefesh has such atzmizdika desire, a core desire. And at that stage, it's not yet in any act, it's not, you can't call it a ratzon. You can't even call it a makkah for ratzon. And yet, once the ratzon comes out and the person does what Hashem wants, Kabbalah sale, or gives the get according to what the Torah says he should do, even though it came from kfiyah, this ratzon is now revealing the true person. This is who the Jew is, truly a Jew that wants to do what the Torah says he should do. So we have here that ratzon reflects. Now, it was pointed out to me this morning that the das hanelam is discussed earlier in chapter 66 of volume 1. And there he does connect it to Heskim, even though there he talks about it all after the Tzimtzum, because those levels of Heskim and Hachlota and all of that we learned in earlier, we talked about it Lifnei Tzimtzum. There he talks about it after the Tzimtzum as Ak, but he does discuss it. So it's worthwhile looking there. And basically he makes the point that the das hanelam is the ratzon Kabbalah sale that's machriach, that the ratzon should come into an active ratzon and not just a heskim, not just a consideration. So there's something that compels person with Kabbalah sale, because this is what's expected of us. That's what he says there. But I don't want to really go into that because it's going to be a little distracting, but it does discuss it there, so it does complement some of what we're saying here. Okay, now we're going to go back to the discussion on Oir.
That's in Ayin Beis in chapter 66.
That's what I just said. Yeah. So now he's going to go back after explaining Ratzon. He's going to say the same thing as with Oir. So he says like this. I'm on page 121. The line is the line begins Richuk. Okay, so the flow goes like this. Just like Ratzon, even though it's Nivdal, I'm just reading a few lines from before, just a few words from the lines before. That he says like this, even though even though the koyach atzmi of Ratzon is separate from it, however, in other words, its existence, its very substance is removed from the etzem. Because this is a ratzon gali, and the etzem is beyond, it's the nefesh, part of the nefesh. And yet, it's eifin of its emergence, the way it emerges, the way it expresses, it's an expression of the soul. He says, Al derech zeh yuvan be'eifin hamtzoas metzias ha'er mid'atzmos. Similarly, we'll understand the way Oir emerges from Atzmus. The Ima Yesha Atzmus Muvdal Be'erech Min Ha'er, even though Atzmus is entirely removed from Oir, as we said, Atzmus can't even be called a Moir, a source of light, because it's beyond being called a source. Atzmus is beyond. And it's not possible to say about Atzmus that he's in a state of closeness, that he so-called gets closer to create something. In lower levels of Elikus, in Gili Elikus, Eir Eliki, we have the concept Koyach HaPoel Benifel, that Elikus manifests and moves closer to the object that it's creating. But you can't say that in the high level, you can't say that on Atzmus. Atzmus is not in a state of Kiruv or Richuk, it's beyond the whole, everything. So even though that's correct, L'kol Mokim, nevertheless, like with Ratzon, the Koyach Atzmi is moved from the Ratzon. And yet the Ratzon reflects and is not in a way that the Ratzon itself is, from its perspective, it's not separate because it's connected to the soul. The same thing here. The existence of Ur from Atzmus, not the Metzias itself. The Ur itself, compared to Atzmus, from Atzmus' perspective, is infinitely distant. It would be like saying a Chassid is Mekusha to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe is infinitely distant from the Chassid, whether he's Mekusha or not Mekusha. But from the point of view of the Chassid, he's completely Mekusha. That's his whole existence, is to be a conduit of what the Rebbe wants of him. So the skashus of the Chassid to the Rebbe doesn't make the Rebbe closer to him, the etzem. It makes him closer to the Rebbe, just as an example. So it came with Ratzon. The nefesh remains removed, but the Ratzon, its personality, its identity, is to express whatever the nefesh wants. Seichel is not that way. Seichel has a particular function focusing on its objective, which is to understand something. It can be driven by the Ratzon of Seichel, which is driven by the nefesh. But the seichel itself is already a particular activity, like I mentioned the difference between the chief of staff and the department heads and people working in the particular functions that they're doing. The same thing with Oir. Yesh, existence, its purpose is to exist. Its purpose and its personality and identity is not a reflection of Elikus. It doesn't have bittul on its own. It's meant to be an independent consciousness, tachtenim, yesh, which through Aveda, the Kavanah is to transform that into becoming Eved Hashem, a servant of God. But Oir, from its inception, from the moment, its very identity is nothing. All it wants to be is I say want is maybe not the right word. All it is bekusher, and therefore a reflection of its source. So the Oir, if you talk about weighing the actual distance, Oir and Yesh are both equally distant from Atzmus. But if you're talking about the identity of how Oir looks at Atzmus and how Yesh looks at Atzmus, Yesh doesn't look at Atzmus, and Oir only looks at Atzmus because it sees Atzmus as its source and is constantly a reflection of whatever the Atzmus wants to reveal, regardless whether Atzmus is revealing all of Atzmus through Oir. From Oir's point of view, there's nothing but Atzmus. And that itself, there's levels of bittul. We're talking now the lowest level, which is Heder Tvisas Mokim, which we'll read them in a moment. So that's the example, and that's the explanation of Ratzon, how it's applied to Eir. Okay. So the Metzias Eir Atzmus is not with a leap. It's from Eir's point of view. Eir says all the time, "Here's my source." And now he's answering the question that he asked all the way back here on page 117, chapter 26. He asked the question, how could you say had the tvisas mokim at l'gabe atzmos? You could say one level of flame, a candle in light of the sun. So he says, Ulechein, shayich leimer ba'er. It's possible to say by the Eir, the hergesha atzmos, the sensing of its source, of atzmos, harihum is battle ba'atzmusei. The Eir becomes fundamentally at its core nullified. She'enu b'chinas tfisas mokim ba'atzmei klal. that it does not sense any sense of self-worth and self-value or self altogether. It doesn't have a self. Why? Because if we were speaking about like a yesh, you can't say that. A yesh doesn't have any of that. But oir, because of its proximity in the sense that it is nothing but reflecting its source, like the rotzen reflecting the nefesh, so therefore it senses its source. Regardless, again, whether the source is infinitely distant, it does sense the source. A yesh does not sense its source. Remember, we spoke 3 levels. The yesh does not sense the source altogether. The seichel senses a koyach hamaskel, but doesn't know what it is. And then there's a level, the yesh doesn't sense it at all. And then there's a level, not only do you know what it is, that there's something, you also know what it is, like ilav olol, yesh mi yesh. When it comes to Eir is not like yesh ma'ayin. Eir does sense a source. Again, the source may be infinitely distant, but from Eir's point of view, there's nothing but the source. It has no other role to play. Its entire role is reflecting what the source is expressing through it. So as such, you can say the word beheaded tfisas smokim, not because it's light compared to another. It's not like a flame or a candle in the light of the sun. A candle in the light of the sun, they're both light, and one light is nullified because of a higher light. Here, it's not so much due to being nullified because it's a higher light, it's due because it senses its source. And like he says now, the next few lines, and being, we're talking here in the highest levels of light, of Ur. This mere fact that Ur is not distant from Atzmus from its perspective, because all it knows is its source, is Atzmus, that is enough. That's enough that through sensing that, because it's such high levels, we'll explain that in a moment, that it's lack of any type of standing and any self-value. And as a result, it comes completely nullified in its core essence. So what is he adding here? I believe I explained this in Ayin Beis as well, because what is this suggesting? Suggesting if lower levels of Ayr, you wouldn't be able to say this, because he says, if it was lower levels, then you could say that even though Ayr is also connected to its source, Ayr always is Dovuk ba'moyer and me'ein ha'moyer. That's always a rule with Ur. Ur is always connected. Even the smallest amount of Ur, even if it gets diminished and goes through many stages in progression, nevertheless, Ur remains Ur. Just like the sunlight, just as the sunlight is right near the sun or in the sun, it's very bright and very hot and much more than so on earth. But when there's sunlight on earth, it's still the sun. It's still connected to a source. If you disconnect the source, the sun will stop shining. The light will stop being. So Ur, by definition, always relates to a source. But what he's suggesting here, my sense of it is, though he doesn't spell it out, and I haven't seen anyone explain it in all the different places this is cited, that in the highest levels, because if Ur was on lower levels, you could say that Ur is also focused on the function that Eibishter wants it. For example, the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is also Ur. It's a level of Ur of Mamala Kalalman, according to the third interpretation, or the second and third interpretation, which means the Ur is focused on Yehi Ur, Yehi Rakia, Ur Alaki, that's manifesting and tailored to creation. Koyach HaPoel Benifel. So there, it still maintains that it's still coming, still the Ur is still reflection of what the Eibishter wants. But there, you can say it's now like a hybrid. We said a murkav, because it's a hybrid. The Ur also has instructions to create light, or to create the heaven, or to create vegetation, or nasa adam, to create a human being, or to create animals. So the Ur, though it is this instruction of the divine instruction, so it's Ur Alaki, but it's Ur Alaki with a particular function. However, in the Madregas Gavoyos, B'Yeser, where Ur, all it is Gilead HaEtzem. And I was wondering, why doesn't he just say, We spoke about in the atzmi, the gilei atzmi of the But it says madregas geveis. It means there, all it is basking and connected to the source itself, to atzmus. So that's enough for it to sense complete nullification of its being. On lower levels, if it's completely nullified, it won't do its function. You want the to be function to serve as, we say, the Dvar Hashem, the word of God and the divine energy is giving life to specifically here to a tree, to an animal, to a human being, to other objects. So there, it has to have that focus as well, that instruction. But the in the highest levels, all it is a reflection of whatever Atmos wants to reveal. We spoke about the concept of awareness, divine awareness. So it basically creates that element of awareness and gilui, which is the inyan of and because it's on these highest levels, so even though, and therefore, the fact that it's a revealer, therefore that's enough because of its proximity. It's completely nullified. Going back to the example with the hiskashus, if the chassid is going off on a shlichus, so he's also bottled in the meshalech, but he has to do his shlichus. He can't be sitting 24/7 and just thinking about the Rebbe. He has to do the work. The work is infused with the directives and with the ratzon, and he knows all the time that he's a shliach. But he has to focus on a shlichus, whether it's a shlichus preparing a Shabbos, or it's a Yom Tov, or it's Hanukkah, or it's other needs. He needs to focus on the mission itself, which is infused. That's like the oyer that relates to the activity, but he's a shliach. When the shliach is mekusher to the Rebbe and he's in the presence of the Rebbe, meaning he's not doing his shlichus, all he is there, I'm here, whatever you want from me. So the Rebbe is shaloi ba'erech to him. But he is, from his perspective, he's completely committed. Tell me what you want. And there's utter nullification because he's actually not supposed to be focusing on the job. If the shliach was focusing on the nullification when he's supposed to do the job, he wouldn't do the job well. He has to use his seichel. He has to use his intelligence, his emotions to deal with the shlichus on the ground. However, in contrast, when he's in the presence of his teacher, of his master, of his Rebbe, there he's not in the form of richog, therefore he's completely nullified. I have no being existence of my own. So that would be an example of what I'm saying. It's only an example because obviously a shliach or a chassid is not a perfect example for oyer, but still, relatively speaking, you see the two different levels here. So as such, you could say on oyer had the tfisas makim. Not like you say from one level of oyer to a higher level, but being that the oyer, all it is reflecting its source. So when it senses its source, it doesn't sense any self, any element of self. That concludes this chapter 28:7, and this mimer actually, with the first level of bitla oyer had the tfisas makim. Now let me just say this from a point of view of avodah, and then I'll happy to take any questions if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay. As I mentioned a number of times, and I think this is the punchline, even though he does not spell it out here, but it's clear from the whole theme and the whole flow from beginning of this whole discussion. And I'm going also back to Ayin Beis, the whole yesh, ayin, yesh, das elyon, das tachten. At the end of the day, the whole purpose of this is, as we said many times, God does not need oyer. It's actually a Gemara, v'chila eirehu tzarich. When they ask the question, what do you need the menorah in the Mishkan? Does the Hashem needs light? So the answer is the menorah was there to illuminate the world. That's why the windows in the Beis Hamikdash were shkufim atumim. They were narrow on the inside and wide on the outside. So God doesn't need oyer to do whatever he has to do. But being that the kavanah is nesava kodesh baruch hu liyisleis baruch dira b'tachtenim, he wants to have a dira b'tachtenim, which means two things. You have tachtenim, which is a structured existence, and the divine is concealed. That's what makes it a tachten, concealment. But the second half, he wants it to be a dira, which is the exact opposite. A dira is not only revelation of the divine is the revelation of the etzem of the divine. In the home, like it says in Chassidus, b'chol atzmusa, you come home, you're not just revealed like you are at the work or in the street. You can kick off your shoes and be the real you in the mashal. And the same thing, dira b'tachtena means adira latzmuse, the core essence. So how can that be achieved in a way that's sensible, that makes sense? So we know the whole Seder Ishtalshelus was created for that purpose. As we said, to first explain how God creates, not that he needs it, but to create a logical process of creation like we learned before, a chayk, kavua, this is the order of how things progress. Keiches atzmim, keiches nalam, keiches gluyim, and everything in Seder Ishtalshelus. And the same thing also, he plants tools and instruments. I'm sorry, the second half is that we can now retrace the steps because there's a whole structure and connect tachtenim back to Oir, or Keli to Oir to Atzmus. Mamala Seviv Atzmus. Now, within that whole Shtalshus, there are instruments. Remember, we learned about Atzilus. In volume 1, we learned what's the purpose of Atzilus. So it says Atzilus gives us the ability to know God and to feel God. Why? Because in Atzilus you have Chabad, you have Meichin and Midas. It's Meichin and Midas of Elikus, it's divine attributes. In Atzilus, Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'gamu echad, everything is divine, but it's a structure. So you could say it's like a holding station where the divine is there, full glory in the structure, however. We can connect because we have Meichin, like he says in Tanya, Nishtalshul Mehen, our Seichel and Midas evolve from the Seichel Midas of Yitzira, from Asiya, Yitzira, Bria to Atzilus. So we have now in Atzilus essentially a template, an archetype of what is true divine intellect, what is true divine emotions. So that in turn allows us to understand God, Ta'asa l'kei avicha, or v'yadaita hayem to know and to feel and experience God emotionally. Like he continues, this is of course the operative pasuk and verse we've been learning, which we'll get back to. And then later says Ein Eid Milvadei. So Atzilus plays that role, the ability to know. What is the role Oyer plays? So remember in volume 1, in the second section, Shvuas Ayin Gimel, when he began discussing the difference between Makif and Pnimi, Oyer HaBligvul and Oyer HaGvul, he said the function of Oyer HaGvul is to create and shape existence, like the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. And what's the function and purpose of the Oyer HaBligvul? Why do you need it? He says to create bittul. Because Oyer HaGvul creates, and as it creates, it's commensurate to. So even though Oyer HaGvul also causes bittul in existence, but it's only a bittul that's bittul hayesh, that relates to existence. And that bittul, he explained, comes from the Oyer HaBligvul, because Oyer HaBligvul is the awe. It's beyond existence. And that introduces bittul. If you recall, you mentioned chapter 66, I mentioned before, all the levels there, how makifim affect existence, was all different levels of bittul, Mesiras Nefesh, and other type of levels. So Oyer in general, you can say, is a force that introduces bittul, which is necessary in making the dira b'tachtein. So the first level of bittul we've learned now. What does it teach us? It teaches us to become aware of our source. And when you're aware of your source, you become less of a yesh. To the point, the highest level would be where you realize you have no self-value in the presence of something greater than you are. If Oyer did not have this feature, or rather, better put, if Oyer didn't exist, where would we learn this from? How, in our Seder Ishtalshelus, in our existence, in B'tzias Nimtza, where would we come to such a awareness? Just like Atzilus is necessary for understanding and feeling God, Oyer gives us the essentially, since Oyer is the force through which the divine creation happens, and the highest levels of Oyer have this level of bittul that we're talking about. So now we have we'll call it in the mechanism of Seder Ishtalshlus, beyond, outside of Atzmus, so to speak. And I say outside, I mean not Atzmus. In Metzias Nimtza, you have the concept of Heder Tfisus Mokim, of sensing a source. And when you sense it, you lose your entire sense of self-identity. So we have here the first step of Bittul that teaches us or introduces to us, and it's embedded all of Ishtalshlus, because remember, the levels of we're talking about, everything is going to come from that This is still a before the Tzimtzum. So the will continue to carry this fundamental, let's call it the message. It's embedded in this itself. And all the way from the highest levels, all the way as it comes down, even into the Koyach Goli. But on the other hand, let's not forget, we still are Tachtenim, which means there's still a structure. So even though we can access this level of Bittul, but the bottom line is, it remains removed from us. That's precisely why it causes Bittul, because it's removed from us. And that's why the Ratzon, like with the mashal of the Ratzon Goli is Shaloi Be'erech to the Ratzon Atzmi in the Nefesh. Or better put, the Ratzon Atzmi is Nivdal and Shaloi Be'erech from the Ratzon Goli. But the Ratzon Goli reflects the Ratzon Atzmi. The Oyer is Shaloi Atzmus is Shaloi Be'erech to Oyer, but Oyer reflects Atzmus. So therefore, from that we learn that remains removed from us. And at the same time, we can learn to have the bittul of reflecting something greater than ourselves, even though that greater than ourselves always remains removed from us. So bittul does not mean you become one with it. It means that you sense its presence, and as a result, you become an extension of it, like the ispashtus hanefesh of Ratzon and the ispashtus ha'etzem through Oyer and Gili ha'Oyer. That sums up more or less this first level of bittul. Obviously, much more can be said. So now it's your turn. If anybody wants to ask anything or wants to comment, please feel free to do so. This is perfect time because we finished this chapter. And I think I explained it to some extent. Always can use more, but anybody?
I have a question. You very nicely gave a mashal about a person next to his Rebbe who feels bitter when he's closer, but does the analogy stop with orbis, or at the same time as being down here, it's also up by its, so to speak, Rebbe, and it always feels a bit though. It's not like it changes or anything as far as bittul. Like it's beyond time and space in that aspect, I think.
Well, so what are you asking me? Whether Oyer goes through changes?
Yeah, well, yeah, because you see when or you use the mashal about chassid being next to a rebbe, he gets bittul close, but that doesn't apply that much to bittul. I mean, that's the analogy stops there. I mean, bittul's.
I said it's an analogy.
Yeah, I understand. I just want to know, but Or is always like close to its source at the same time being down here.
Well, Oyer has no bchira. Remember, the key difference is that Oyer does not have free will. Oyer is what it is. Oyer is an instrument of God's to express himself and to reveal and to create awareness. I was trying to explain that you can be reflecting your etzem and still be infinitely distant from it. We human beings, once you get to the avoid of it, and the shliach example and the chassid and so on, you're talking about bchira. Obviously, we choose it. We have to choose it, and we have to always work on it, and we can always grow. We are not natural Oyer. We're a natural yesh. We just have Oyer within us. That's what the neshama is. Essentially, if you didn't have a neshama, you only had a guf, you'd be a yesh, and that would be it. There'd be no redemption. Even if the yesh is created by atzmos, you would never be able to do anything with it. It's the Oyer ha-neshama. The neshama is ner Hashem nishmas adam. It's a light. And we have Torah Oyer. This is why I said about Keirach and the Meraglim. Keirach said, you know what, the Yesh has everything. We don't need any Giluyim. That's not true. Without a Neshama, without Torah Oyer, we can never get to the states of Bittul that are necessary. So if to distinguish Oyer as being a mechanism God puts into place, that's Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's all it is God built a Metzias Nimtza, manifesting in some Metzias Nimtza, a bridge between Bilta Mitzvah to Mitzvah, and the only thing that could do that right, the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe is Oyer. Remember, the Kabbalists struggled to find a level that can relate to existence and still relate to Atzmos, and they could not find it because Kesed and Rotzen by them was always a step below. In Samach Vav Vayelech, I mentioned a number of times, that's where he explains the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe Oyer. It is only Oyer that is the right example because Oyer is an entity, but it's nothing but reflection of Atzmos. Rotzen even is not that level. That's why I want to make the distinction. Here, he's not nochis here to go into the distinction. Here he wants to use Rotzen as an example to understand. But in truth, Oyer is higher than Rotzen, obviously. We had learned that earlier. That's why Rotzen itself emerges from Oyer. But for all practical purposes, an example here, it works very well because Rotzen is infinite, is removed from the nefesh and yet reflects the nefesh. So yes, that's the distinction. So I'm basically acknowledging what you said. I just wanted to expand on it a bit. Yeah.
Thank you.
You have to also keep in mind that, especially Lifnei Tzimtzum, but in general, all these concepts are timeless. They're not. This is not a level. It's all timeless. It's right now. You have this level of Oyer. We're soon going to be level. We're actually soon, or maybe today even. We're going to hopefully begin the second stage or the second Eifen of Bitla, which is deeper. And all these levels of Bitla are going to be teaching us levels of how we can climb and connect more and more to our source, our connection. Okay. Does anybody else want to weigh in or say anything? Okay. If not, which is fine, which is good. So I'm not going to learn the end of the Maimer because it's a Lech Lecha Maimer actually. This week's last week's Parsha. But if you want, you can read it yourself. I don't want to go into it because it's just going to be distracting. What I will do now, we're going back to Ayin Beis.
Jacobson.
Because the next time we go back to Tzaddik Dalet will be page 137, and there he goes to the second Eifen HaBitl. So in the order we've been learning, we learned the first Eifen HaBitl of Heder Tfisas Mokim in Ayin Beis. We learned it in Tzaddik Dalet. We're going to now learn the second Eifen. So I'm closing Tzaddik Dalet. For those that are not familiar with his back and forth with the books, let me just explain. This class is in Ayin Beis. We began around over 8 years ago learning it. When the 100th, the centennial, so 1912, we began approximately, I believe, in 2011, 2012. Like 9 years ago, we began learning it from volume 1. We're now deep in volume 2. We're on page 1157. But from time to time, when we learn it, we find explanations by other Rabbeim, in this case, the Frierdiker Rebbe. So we therefore been learning actually 2 Hemshechim at once. So the whole Tzaddik Dalet of the Frierdiker Rebbe, delivered Rosh Hashanah 1933 through the winter of 33, is all based on the Ayin Beis that began actually not so far back. The Rosh Hashanah Maimer of Ayin Vav. So we've been learning back and forth. We learn the Ayin Beis. We go to the Tzaddik Dalet that explains it. There's going to be a point where the Tzaddik Dalet ends, and we'll continue only Ayin Beis. Now, if you want the texts, both texts of Ayin Beis and Tzaddik Dalet are on ayinbeis.com online. We've scanned it all, PDF pages, so you can look at all. You can look up everything we've been learning in the actual text. Yeah, so it all began here, page 1140. We're now at 1157. Basically 17 pages ago, but Tzaddik Dalet elaborates in some places pages upon pages, which is why these last few Maimorim are, probably 70, 80 classes in each Maimer, because we've also learning Tzaddik Dalet. So you're getting two for the price of one, basically. And both are the two deepest Hemshechim. The deepest Hemshech in Chassidus is Ayin Beis, and the deepest Maimorim from the Frierdiker Rebbe is Tzaddik Dalet. So it doesn't get better than this. Even though, all Chassidus is great, but I'm just saying this is like, Tell somebody you're learning Ayin Beis, they say, oh, wow. Tell somebody you're learning Ayin Beis and Tzaddik Dalet, that's already can blow the circuits. So we're going to go back now to page 1157 and keep in mind the flow. We're explaining the Ayin Be'emtza between Yesh and Yesh, which divides into two, but we're talking about the higher Ayin, the bittul of and we're now going to go to, he said there are several Efanim in the bittul of that itself senses bittul and das elyon, and now he's going to go to the second Eifan. All this is coming to explain das elyon, das tachten. The whole thing began with difference between Shabbos and weekdays, the man, lechem min hashamayim, lechem min haaretz, which gives us lechem min hashamayim, a taste of heaven of das elyon, lechem min haaretz, a taste of earth, das tachten, the ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. And this is all going to bring us back to the pasuk v'yadaita Ayin v'ashavesa levavecha ki Hashem hu Elokim v'shamayim mimal v'al haaretz mitachas ein oid. So all this is explaining that verse, v'yadaita, to know God. What does v'yadaita mean? So we're speaking about there's going to be two ways of knowing. The higher way of knowing, which is from the top down, and the lower way from the bottom up. So right now, we're going to move now to the second Eifan of Bittul of the Oir. So if you see, it's the new paragraph on page Aleph Kuf Nun Zayin, 1157. Okay. The Beis. So Ha'aleph, if you look, the first Eifan was the top of page 1155. He said, just to go back, he says, and he started Ha'aleph on page 1155 through 1157 is the first Eifan. So all the following, Beis and Gimel and Dalet, which is going to be the next two pages, is following that opening, that there are Kama Efanim in Bittul. Beis. Beis, the Eifan Beis, the second Eifan, the second approach in Bittul, Be'inyan HaBitla Eir. What is this second approach, second Eifan? Hulias, the Metzias Eir B'Mekede, Hu Davka, the Advekus B'Mekede. Here the focus is going to be not on the contrast between Eir and its source, where because it senses its source, it's nullified in its presence. Like we said, a student, a great scholar, in the presence of a greater scholar will be nullified. But that's due to their relationship. It doesn't tell us about what the fundamental nature of the lesser scholar is. In presence of when it senses air, uchamhu, remember Keser. Keser is a great light, a great energy. But it's darkened and blackened, itself. Being that the air comes from its source, it dafke through his bimke earlier. But they're the focus, because their focus was margish, that it senses its source and therefore it's nullified. Here, because with dafke, the air is only possible because it's connected to its source. Disconnect the source from the light, it ceases to be. If the air was not attached to its source, just hypothetically, he's going to bring the example of the sun. But I'll just, before we read it inside, if for whatever reason you severed the light of the sunlight from its source, you some way, what would happen? No more light. Light has no being of its own. It's completely due to its being connected. It wouldn't be in a state of light. Like it is with the light of the sun. Is dafka through the source being revealed. And that the light is attached to its source, in its source. So then you have the existence of air. The Inyan, he says now in the parentheses, The Inyan his galus mekede. What does it mean his galus mekede? Why are you adding that? His galus mekede. So he says, move on. It's understood. She'ein zeb b'chinas his galus v'amshocha. It doesn't mean his galus mekede that the mocker itself is being revealed and being transmitted. Rak haviyese biz galus. B'loshen Yiddish was eris faran. So what he means by his galus mekede does not mean that the mocker itself is being transmitted into light. It means that its existence is present. In other words, it's not concealed. So its existence is revealed, not that it itself is transmitted into the light. In Yiddish, vos eris faran. Okay. In the Tzaddik Dalet, he's going to elaborate more on this, what this really comes to say, if I recall correctly. Let me just look for a moment. It's on page, 1 second, just give me a moment. Like, what is he trying to say with this? Yeah, he explains it more. The point being is that's not just enough for the light to be attached to the sun's presence has to be there. Presence means not its actual atzmizdika presence, that the sun is, there's a source. The source has to exist for the light to be there. And so two things are necessary. His galus hamoyer, his galus mekede, I should say, and devekus b'mekede. That the mocker is apparently there, it's existent there. And the second thing is that the light is attached to it. Shari kashanonim avdilim ben hashemesh va'er. Because when clouds separate between the sun and the light and sunlight, ena er meir, the sun does not shine, the light does not shine. Now, obviously, he doesn't mean you see that even with clouds, the day does not become suddenly dark. However, if it's very dark clouds, if the sky completely gets the darkened clouds, yeah, it could become like night. But the point he wants to make is that Oyer is affected by whether the sun is completely revealed or not. If there are clouds, what happens? Those of us that are on this side of the clouds, not the other side, not above the clouds somewhat cloud and shroud the sunlight. If it's dark enough, the light won't shine properly. If it's very dark, it could be even darker. It's like exactly like curtains. So we could have translucent, transparent, you could have opaque. Bottom line is you can have clouds, different clouds. He's not going into the details. It's not relevant, the details, what kind of clouds. But his bottom line is saying that the light is affected by what you place in front of the sun. If there's something blocking the sun, in this case clouds, the light will not shine. What he means here, not shine either completely, or if it's dark enough, not at all. So that's Bapashtas what he means. I believe again in Tzaddik Dalet, he says he may say something as well about this. Let me just look a second. Interesting here. He doesn't even bring about the clouds. He just brings the shkia, which we're going to read about in a moment. Maybe later. Oh, no, he does bring about. Okay. Whatever we're learning, we're going to elaborate more in Tzaddik Dalet. I don't want to keep going back and forth. I just wanted to see what he says. Okay. So what we see from the clouds is that light is impacted by its connection to its source. You do anything to cover the source or block it or even limit it, it will affect the light. And light is directly connected to the sources being there present and being connected, attached to it. Ukeshenister gufi shel shemesh, and when the body of the sun, the actual sun, is covered up, ukamay b'shkiyas hashemesh. So when the sun sets, so now it's not just clouds. The sun is now completely concealed. The earth, the place where it sets. So the sun continues to shine in a different part of the earth. But in this part of the earth where after the shkia, the sun is completely covered. Eina er nimtza. Interesting. By the clouds, he said, Eina er meir, that the light doesn't shine, which means completely shine, but it's still light. There's still light there. Because the sun is still there, it's just the clouds are not letting it shine properly or shine. Here he's saying the light no longer exists. So by the shkia, it completely cuts off light altogether. So the sun continues to shine, but in a different part of the earth. It's been completely concealed. That's the shkia. So eina ner nimtza, there is no air. No air remains after the shkia. It's not like, okay, the shkia, the sun moved on, the light remains hanging out for a while. No. Sun is gone, the light is gone. So he speaks both concealing the light or somewhat concealing and then gone. Alkain. I'm sorry. This is all an example. Same thing as with the air lamaila. That the air exists only due to the fact that it's connected to a source. Alkain nirgish by air. And therefore, it is felt in the air. Its entire existence doesn't have any existence of its own. Its entire existence is due to its source. The light will never be deceived into thinking it has any independent existence. And without the source, its source, it does not exist. Take away the source, the light doesn't exist. I'll read one more line. And this is the level of bittul and air, that it's not an existence on its own. Its entire existence is only due to its source. We're going to discuss the distinction between this and the first Eifin, but briefly, it's very clear. In the first Eifin, we didn't talk about the Metzias Ha'er. Metzias Ha'er is bottled because it's in the presence of its source. Now we're saying that the Eir itself doesn't have any existence without its source. Not just it's bottled and nullified, like a flame in the light of the sun, because something greater, or the fact that it senses its source. Here is because it knows and recognizes that it doesn't have anything on its own. Okay, we're going to stop here. So middle of page 1157, the line Mekede. And we're going to continue to learn this. We'll learn Eifin Beis, and then we're going to go back to, which is still the top of 1158. Before we go to the third Eifin, we're going to go back to Tzaddik Dalet, where there's plenty discussion on this second Eifin. And then the third Eifin, and then there's going to be the fourth, closer to the bottom of 1158. If you want to peek ahead. Okay, let us stop here.